How many people know about the CDC whistleblower cover-up? Okay. All right. Well, we'll let Dr. Andy Wakefield tell us his story.
Right. I'm Andy Wakefield. Through the 90s, I ran a large research team at the Royal Free Hospital in London. Part of the University of London, our specific interest was inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's disease, and ulcerative colitis. We became very interested in measles. We published a paper in the Lancet in 1995, and on the back of that paper, which linked the single measles vaccine to Crohn's disease, I got a series of calls from parents saying that my child was perfectly well, they had an MMR vaccine, they lost all of their acquired skills, and they became ultimately autistic. And the way I was trained in medicine was invested in the patient's story or the parent's story in particular, because no one knows a child better than their mother, certainly much better than any public health doctor or pediatrician. And so, based upon that very formal classical training in medicine, I took their story seriously, we investigated it, and we did colonoscopy, upper endoscopy on these children, and found that the parents were absolutely right. They had an inflammatory bowel disease. They'd been suffering for years, but unable to articulate that pain except through self-injury or aggression. When the parents said my child regressed after a vaccine, we took that extremely seriously. We investigated, and many, many years later, I am completely convinced that the parents once again were right. The medical profession was wrong, remains wrong. We were interested at the time in pattern of exposure. One of the common questions that we got is, why do all children get MMR vaccine and why do only some develop autism? Well, not all smokers develop lung cancer. This is just one of those idiosyncrasies of medicine, and we were interested in cofactors, something about that modified the pattern of exposure, and one of those was age of exposure. We know that the age of exposure to an infection determines the outcome from that infection. The younger you are, the greater the risk of, say, an adverse outcome from measles infection. So we put forward the hypothesis that in autism, one of the risks was younger age of exposure to measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. Not the only risk, but certainly a major determinant of that risk. And we shared that hypothesis with the CDC and with the US Congress back in the early 2000s. And the CDC went away and tested that hypothesis. And in the interim, let me just, in really 20 years that I've been involved in autism, these children, the bowel disease, the aberrant bowel findings, bowel bacteria that are clearly altered in children with autism has become the most common research finding. In other words, the science has borne out exactly what we published in the Lancet in 1998. However, because the bowel disease was synonymous in the minds of many people with vaccine injury, it had to be crushed, it had to be suppressed, and it had to be ignored. And so pediatricians, pediatric gastroenterologists did not do their job. They put their own careers before their patients because they said, I know you may be right, I know your child's suffering, but this isn't going to be good for me, so could you go and find another doctor? And that is what has happened. So for many, many years, these children have suffered needlessly, and they've suffered because they had to discredit the bowel disease in order to protect the vaccination. So all of this would have remained just the same. It would have got worse. Now we'd have had mandatory vaccination throughout the country, and the situation would have escalated to the predicted 1 in 2 children born in 2032 having autism. That is what we face right now based upon the CDC's own numbers. Were it not for one man. One man is Dr. William Thompson, senior scientist from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, who some 14 years ago was one of a group of doctors there who tested the hypothesis that younger age of MMR vaccination was indeed a risk for autism, and that's exactly what they found. They spent the next 14 years concealing that risk. He was so perplexed by that concealment that ultimately he came forward to a friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Brian Hooker, a man with a vaccine-injured son, and confessed to him the full extent of the crime, provided to him all of the data outputs, all of the analysis plans, all of the internal email communications going right up the hierarchy to the very top of the CDC, alerting them to the fact that younger age of MMR vaccination was a major risk factor for autism. They put millions and millions of children in harm's way, healthy children, in order to protect what? Their own policy, their own credibility, and their partners in the industry. And that is the greatest medical fraud in the history of the world. Why? Because these people were charged with caring for these children, for their well-being. This is not a drug that's being used in end-stage cancer where the pharmaceutical industry just fiddles some figures to give it a better appearance. These are all healthy children in the world who are being mandated to be given these vaccines, with over 200 new vaccines going through the process of approval and licensing right now, and many of those will find their way onto the schedule. They did this deliberately, they did it callously, they did it recklessly, and countless numbers of children have paid a huge, huge price. So, until the day I die, we'll never walk away from this issue. And I realized that some years ago, to beat the media, you had to become the media. And I teamed up with my friend and colleague, Dale Bigtree, the front producer on a new documentary which brings to the public, to those who don't know or don't care or don't think this is their problem, Dr. Williams' story, Thompson's story, his confession, and the true extent and nature of the fraud at the CDC. This is not an isolated incident, and I believe that it will open the can on many, many other such incidents that have happened at the CDC. They cannot be trusted. They are an utter, utter disgrace, and it is my job to try and expose that. Thank you.